On April 12, 2015, 25-year-old Freddie Gray was arrested by the Baltimore Police Department for possession of an illegal switchblade. Gray was placed in a police van, and during transportation he fell into a coma and was eventually taken to a trauma center. On April 18, 2015, residents of Baltimore, Maryland gathered in front of the Western District Police Station to protest Gray's treatment by the police. The following day, Gray died of spinal cord injuries, and protests expanded when this became public knowledge. Over the next several weeks, the national media reported on the ferment in Baltimore, which included spontaneous demonstrations against police brutality, as well as civil unrest and rioting. During the period, a state of emergency was declared in the city, thousands of police and National Guard were deployed, and at least 250 people were arrested, with 20 officers injured. On May 1st, after a medical examiner's report ruled Gray's death a homicide, state prosecutors concluded that there was probable cause to file criminal charges against the 6 officers involved. By July 27th, all of the officers were acquitted, had a mistrial, or charges were dropped. On September 12th, the Justice Department announced it would not be bringing federal charges against the 6 officers. The media attention spotlighted a number of issues that deserve research into the history of now. The death of Freddie Gray and the public's response followed a series of high-profile incidents involving police actions that led to the injury or death of African Americans in particular, a trend that should be scrutinized historically. Similarly, the American public seemed surprised to discover the militarization of the police that had taken place steadily over the past several decades, linked to the national security state and the surplus of military hardware. But for this segment of the history of now, we're going to focus on one of the most commented upon aspects of the events in Baltimore, the enormous racial disparity in economic conditions in American urban centers, and in particular the disparity in housing and its relationship to race.
Now in Baltimore, 148,000 people, a disproportionate number of them African American, live below the poverty line. That is 28.3% of the population of the city. And Baltimore is but one example of the inequality of housing conditions all throughout the country. You could expand this to include Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and on and on. African Americans make up 15% of the U.S. population, but they are 48% of public housing residents. Similarly, African American family incomes are 60% those of white Americans, so there's a disparity in income. But the disparity in home ownership is much more dramatic. In that case, the figure is African American home equity is 5% of whites. On the other hand, Baltimore contains areas of such wealth that the Business Journal recently ranked its Towson metropolitan area as the 18th most affluent of the nation's 942 metropolitan areas. So this appears to me to be an excellent point for historical intervention in our regular segment, The History of Now. And the question for today, for this segment, is why is there such a large racial disparity in household wealth? Now, it may surprise you to learn that this concentration of household wealth in places like Baltimore can be traced back in part to the New Deal and the ways in which welfare reforms were complicated by the politics of race. Last week we were discussing the New Deal's response to the Great Depression, and we talked about the array of programs designed to combat unemployment, homelessness, and the economic dislocation that came with the Depression. The New Deal had a slogan of the 3 R's that stood for relief, recovery, and reform. Now, reform in particular was partially aimed at the enormous economic inequality of the 1920s, which many held to be responsible for the stock market burst. Through a dizzying array of programs and agencies, the New Deal sought to curb some of the destabilization believed to have been caused by the economic inequality by institutionalizing the modern welfare state, creating a safety net to help in times of economic destabilization. And the New Deal seems to have there's at least a correlation between the Depression and the New Deal and a period in which economic inequality was at a low in the United States. So you see in this chart, this is a chart of economic inequality, with the highest spikes of inequality in the 1920s and then later on in the 2000s. The period from the Depression through the New Deal through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s is a period of low economic inequality in the United States. One of the areas that the New Deal targeted for reform was housing policy. In his second inaugural address in 1937, Franklin Roosevelt expressed his frustration at seeing, quote, 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. And despite a flurry of activity and programs in his first term, it was clear that there was still a lot of work to be done to promote recovery and reform of the United States economy. 12.5 million workers were still unemployed, 9,000 banks were closed, new home construction had dropped 95% below the 1920s rate. So you had cities like Chicago and Baltimore that were mired in housing crises, exacerbated by the movement of families into urban centers in search of work during the Great Depression. And housing was among the key problems that the New Deal sought to address through a number of means. First, private development and programs for homeowners, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This is to stimulate new home construction, because new home construction had plummeted so far below the 1920s figures. And the Federal Housing Administration, also designed to help supply low-cost loans to homeowners to build their own houses. And this helps to expand the suburbs during the period of during the Depression. Similarly, there was the United States Housing Authority was created, or the USHA. This was aimed at affordable housing for the working poor. So the first two were primarily aimed at the suffering middle class and upper middle class. The 1937 U.S. Housing Authority was aimed at affordable housing for the working poor. Earlier, the Public Works Administration, or the WPA, created and directed housing developments. But in 1937, under the Wagner-Steagall Housing Act, the policy shifted. Federally guaranteed loans and grants to build low-income housing was an unprecedented example of the expansion of the welfare state. And it was an evolution of progressive ideas, and reformers were really optimistic, as you can see from some of these brochures, that they were going to eliminate slums from the United States. Okay, so there's an issue here, though. And the issue is that federal government maintained a policy of racial segregation in public housing nationwide. This was true in northeastern cities like New York and border cities like Baltimore and St. Louis. Federal housing policy thus reinforced private policy. So in 1925, in Baltimore, 18 Baltimore neighborhood associations came together to form the Allied Civic and Protective Association for the purpose of urging both new and existing property owners to sign restrictive covenants. Restriction covenants are agreements between neighborhood associations committing them to never sell to African Americans. So this is before the Great Depression. This is in 1925. Neighborhood associations coming together to agree to commit themselves to never sell to Black Americans. Then such covenants were often city-sponsored. So first you have it as neighborhood associations, then they get some government sponsorship on the municipal level. Furthermore, though, the FHA during the New Deal explicitly barred subdivision developers from qualifying for federal subsidies unless they also committed to excluding African Americans. So now you have a New Deal policy on the federal level encoding racial segregation into its policies. The FHA also barred Black people from obtaining bank mortgages for suburban divisions and refused to insure mortgages in Black neighborhoods through a process that came to be called redlining. That is, drawing up maps of cities and color-coding areas that were considered to be poor credit risks. From the Federal Housing Authority's own underwriting manual, we have the following quote: red areas, and you can see this in this map right here, red areas are characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, undesirable population or infiltration of it, some mortgage lenders may refuse to make loans in these neighborhoods, and others will lend only on a conservative basis. This map right here is a map drawn up by the Federal Housing Authority, showing you in color-coded areas desirable neighborhoods versus undesirable neighborhoods. And this is the street map of the Baltimore area. I believe this map is from 1937. It wasn't just Baltimore. So we can see this is the map of Philadelphia. Red areas color-coded as undesirable areas. Incidentally, big portion of that red area right there is where I grew up in Philly. Here is Brooklyn with its areas color-coded. Red-lined areas considered to be undesirable populations. St. Louis, San Francisco, Oakland, etc. Unable to get mortgages and restricted by policy to overcrowded neighborhoods where housing supply was short, African Americans either rented apartments at considerably higher rates or bought homes on installment plans and called contract sales at much higher interest rates and with substantially less security of accumulated equity. What this meant was that investment in real estate was essentially impossible in most of the places where, due to explicit policies of racial segregation, African Americans lived. This is the essence of ghettoization. It's a deliberate policy of segregated neighborhoods. And home equity is one aspect of the massive disparity in economic income inequality. Here's a map of just some of the cities that I just pointed out. I'm putting this map up to illustrate that this was a nationwide phenomenon. This is racial segregation nationwide, not restricted to the South. In Baltimore and elsewhere, the distressed condition of African American working and lower middle class families can be largely attributable to the history of federal policy that prohibited black families from accumulating housing equity during the suburban boom that moved white families into single-family homes from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s, thus being able to leave to their children wealth that they had accumulated in a way that African Americans could not. So again, back to this question, why is there such a large racial disparity in household wealth? It's at least partially attributable to deliberate federal policy. One of the consequences is now there is a 20-year difference in life expectancy between those who live in Baltimore's most affluent neighborhood and those who live 6 miles away in its most impoverished. So here is a map of where the percentage of residents who are black in the Baltimore area on the left, and then the percentage of population that is unemployed looking for work. You also see these are some of the key areas of protests in Baltimore in April 2015. And if you were to take this map and go all the way back to the 1930s and look at redlining, it lines up perfectly. This neighborhood has been in a depressed economic condition for, going on 80 years or more.
So here's a question for you. What is the legacy of the New Deal today? Where do you see the politics of welfare currently in action? Find a story in the news about any aspect of welfare in American society, the welfare state. Do a little research on its history. Write a 1 to 2 page analysis of your findings and cite your sources. Upload to Canvas by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, April 29th, and earn up to 25 points for participation. By 1945, the enormous devastation of the Second World War had begun affecting changes to the entire world that were enormous and permanent. These changes can be summed up by a single word: on August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. This was the first time that a nuclear device had been used on a city. Approximately 80,000 people, predominantly civilians, were incinerated instantly. Upwards of 50,000 more died from radiation and injuries by the end of the year. The bomb completely destroyed 70% of the city of Hiroshima. 2 days later, on August 8th, the Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan and began an invasion from the north. The following day, Nagasaki became the second and last city in history so far to be hit with a nuclear bomb, when the United States dropped Fat Man on it, killing another 75,000 people. Japan surrendered on August 15th. These before and after shots symbolize a great rupture in world history, the destruction of one age and the introduction of the atomic age. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has a unique place in historical memory, but we could also see it as the logical endpoint of total war. This is a picture of Tokyo in the aftermath of firebombing of March 1945, in which the Allies used cutting-edge incendiary devices to literally set the entire capital on fire. An estimated 100,000 people died from this technique, and urban cities like Toyama were completely destroyed. This was the dawn of the atomic age, and Americans and the rest of the world responded to it with contradictory feelings. Some Americans greeted this new era with awe and euphoria about the possibilities of the future. Watching the purplish cloud rise 40,000 feet into the atmosphere, co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis said, "Even though we had expected something terrific, what we saw made us feel like that we were Buck Rogers' 25th century warriors." For others, the bomb seemed to signal the end of the world. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist known as the father of the atomic bomb, said that the successful detonation of the bomb had brought to mind words from the Bhagavad Gita, quote, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." What's my point? The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the end point of a total war that had engulfed the world for 6 years. An alien looking down from space in August 1945 would see a world destroyed. None of us can really comprehend the devastation. World War II left the international system completely shattered. All across the planet, broken societies and economies were in desperate need of repair, and there were competing models about how to do this among the victors. Just take a look at the death statistics from World War II, by far the most devastating global war in history to date. Take some time looking through this. These are ordered from the countries that had the largest death tolls down to the smallest. You'll note immediately that the Soviet Union far outstrips the death toll of all the other countries involved, with the Soviet Union losing almost 14% of its population. And then check the figures for the world estimates at the bottom. Total military and civilian deaths amounted approximately globally to 75,000 million people. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender. After 6 years of total war, there was a moment of pure euphoria throughout Europe. But this euphoria subsided quickly as Americans and Europeans realized the enormity of the war's destruction. Much of Europe was a wasteland. Like Japan, many of the world's greatest cities, centers of imperial power, Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna, Leningrad, had been reduced to rubble. The European economy had completely collapsed, with more than 70% of its industrial infrastructure gone. The occupation of Eastern Europe and Germany brought the Allies face to face with the unfathomable horror of the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million Jews, 2/3 of their population in Europe, were killed in a program of state-sponsored genocide. Other victims of Nazi industrial slaughter, Romani, homosexuals, communists, the disabled, brought the final figure to perhaps as many as 17 million people. Again, it is nearly impossible for us today to understand the psychic trauma of all of this. Occupying this wasteland were the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. When the war came to an end, Germany had been split into 4 pieces as the occupying powers negotiated over a post-war settlement. Complicating things even further was the fourfold occupation of the German capital of Berlin. The occupying powers faced complex and daunting problems. The first was recovery. What could be done about the tremendous suffering, the economic and humanitarian crisis that post-World War Europe faced? Some 35 million people died in Europe during the war, and tens of millions of hungry, homeless refugees called displaced persons struggled to survive in the wasteland. Hunger reigned. In Poland, for example, 2/3 of all cattle were gone. For Europe as a whole, food production was less than 2/3 of its pre-war total, and it was impossible to get what food there was distributed since the entire transportation infrastructure was destroyed. Disease and starvation greeted the survivors of 1945. Survivors faced the monstrous task of rebuilding a world destroyed. Linked to this was a second question concerning the political reconstruction of Europe. Who would control the post-war order? World War II saw the destruction of not only the fascist regimes of Hitler and Mussolini, but also the weakening of liberal democratic political orders and the empires they controlled. During the war, local resistance movements inspired by socialist ideals and supported in part by the Soviet Union had fought hard against the fascist war machines and were determined to guide the post-war order. Their ambitions conflicted with those of the Allied governments of Britain and the United States and set the stage for the ideological battle over the post-war order, which would shape the coming Cold War. Finally, there was the immediate question of the alliance itself. What would become of the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States? These 3 powers had cooperated for the past 4 years in their struggle against the Nazi onslaught, but all 3 had very different interests and concerns when it came to the world order to be built from the rubble of total war. Given its central role in the post-war order, the Soviet Union deserves a special look. World War II had brought colossal, almost incomprehensible devastation to the Soviet Union. This image of Stalingrad provides a sense of the devastation in line with what we see in the Pacific and Western Europe. In 1947, the Kremlin published a report of the war damage the Soviet Union had suffered at the hands of the Nazis. It was a story of plunder, rape, cruelty, and suffering that challenged the imagination. The German invaders had destroyed over 17,100 cities and towns, 70,000 villages, 31,000 industrial centers. They blew up railroads, roads, and bridges, stole and ransacked the countryside, destroying tens of thousands of collective farms and farm machines. The Soviet economy was decimated, roughly 23 million people dead, more than half of those civilians. 1 out of every 4 citizens were killed or wounded. For millions, the end of the war meant a new wave of starvation, disease, and forced labor. It would take 30 years for the population to reach its pre-war levels. For 4 years, the Red Army pushed the front line west, and by the war's end had occupied most of Eastern Europe: Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Albania. By the time they met with the Allied soldiers pushing from the east, the Red Army had occupied East Germany, including part of Berlin, where the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. So what were the Soviet priorities in 1945? What do you imagine was foremost on Stalin's mind? Then there is the enormous and ambiguous parts of the planet that came to be known as the Third World, but what is at this time called the colonized world. It's very dangerous to generalize about such a great swath of geography. We'll be returning to that problem throughout the rest of the class. Much of this part of the world was bound by the common experience of Western imperialism. Nationalism and anti-imperialism cannot be exaggerated in these parts of the world. On the eve of World War II, European countries had claimed some form of direct or indirect control of close to 70% of the planet. European powers controlled close to half of Asia, including the British Empire's crown jewel, India. Having scrambled for possessions in Africa, European nations owned roughly 90% of that continent, tied to the economies of core countries through raw material extraction, labor, and markets. World War II didn't destroy the colonized world, but it did fatally wound European imperialism. As it turned out, World War II would prove to be the death knell for the traditional forms of imperialism. First, the war so weakened Western economies that they simply could not afford to maintain large empires. Second, and more importantly, the war itself sparked and energized nationalist movements throughout the colonized world, movements that would bring about a wave of decolonization in the post-war period. And what about the United States? Yes, indeed. What about the United States? The United States was the only nation involved in World War II to emerge from the total war not only intact but unambiguously strengthened and empowered by the experience. Alone, the United States came out of World War II not only a full-fledged global power for the first time in its history, but the preponderant power in the world. In fact, the United States stood on the cusp of an unprecedented 25-year period of economic growth that would fuel domestic prosperity and global expansion in the coming decades. The war's impact on U.S. history and by extension on the entire world cannot be exaggerated. The title of this video is not hyperbole. Well, maybe a little. The United States that emerged from the war in 1945 was in fundamental ways no longer the same nation it had been in 1941. As we'll see, it is appropriate to argue that for America, World War II changed everything. And again, this transformation is best captured by one word: boom. In fact, the United States and Americans experienced a series of booms as a result of World War II. The first, and probably most important, was a production boom. The war kicked the American economy into overdrive, and this is a lesson that would not be lost on American leaders. The war radically transformed the economic and social landscape of the United States as it mobilized its tremendous productive capacity for the war effort in the process that brought the Great Depression to a sudden end. The war called for constant and accelerated production. All major industries were directed towards the war, pumping out weapons, tanks, planes, ships, oil, everything needed to supply a total war effort. This unprecedented production was exemplified by the Willow Run plant in Michigan, which became the largest such factory in the world with a single building that was up to 60 acres long and employing 40,000 men and women in its assembly lines. Because of such plants, by 1944, American factories were producing an airplane every 5 minutes and a ship every single day. The dimensions of this production boom cannot be underestimated. By the end of the war in 1945, the United States produced half of all the world's manufacturing. By 1945, American workers produced 57% of the world's steel, 43% of the world's electricity was generated by the United States, 62% of the world's oil was produced in the United States, and the United States produced 80% of all the world's automobiles. The United States accounted for 7% of the world's population, but it possessed 42% of global wealth. The United States in 1945 held 75% of the entire world's gold supply was in the United States Treasury. Unemployment went from 14.6% in 1940 to just 1.2% in 1944. Economists call this number, in terms of unemployment, full employment. The 1.2 is so negligible, it's almost as if the United States is fully employed. And this last statistic is very significant. World War II put Americans back to work. In fact, entirely new groups of Americans were working. Women entered the workforce at an unprecedented rate. By 1944, women made up 1/3 of the civilian labor force. Married women in their 30s outnumbered single women. African Americans contributed hugely. As part of the Great Migration, some 1 million black Americans moved out of the South into the production centers, and another 1.5 million would follow in the 1950s. Furthermore, union membership also soared in this period, from about 9 million in 1940 to 14 million in 1945. Already a trend in the New Deal, the war pushed the government to force companies to recognize unions in order to prevent labor strife and keep the factories humming. How did all of this happen? This leads us to a second boom. The government boom. The bottom line really was massive government spending. Government spending was twice as much during the war than it had been for the previous 150 years combined. Where did all that money come from? Well, it was during the war period that the government began the practice of withholding taxes from paychecks, payroll taxes. Before World War II, only 4 million Americans even paid income taxes. But after the war, 40 million did. The war strengthened the power of the federal government. All new wartime agencies like the War Board and the Office of Price Administration reached deeper into American society and economy, and rather than disbanding, were reconfigured later in peacetime. Whole industries were taken over by the government during the wartime or for the emergency of the war. Wages were fixed by the government, rents, prices, and production quotas. For example, say you're a vintage car collector and you're looking for a 1942 model Ford or Chrysler. You'll never find one. Why not? The government ordered those companies not to make any new model cars and to devote all their productive energy towards the war. This shows you a big important point about the war was that the government boom was also corresponded by a big business boom. So business did very well as a result of this production explosion. Finally, one last boom. In August 1945, 12.1 million Americans were still in uniform. Nearly two-thirds of all American men aged 18 to 34 were overseas at the time. GIs clamored for a return to normalcy. Demobilization followed quickly. In May 1946, exactly 9 months after VJ Day, births increased measurably all across the United States. This was the baby boom. This trend continued so that by the end of 1946, an all-time high record of 3.4 million babies had been born. That's 20% more than in 1945. They reached a peak in 1947 but remained high all throughout the 1960s. The baby boom was both the cause and the consequence of the mass consumer explosion that transformed America beginning in the 1950s. There are all sorts of debates about the reasons why, and of course these figures vary across racial and class lines, but the baby boom does seem to reflect a general optimism about the future and about America's grand expectations. World War II was an ideological war, fought ultimately to contrast American society from fascism and totalitarianism. FDR encapsulated this in what he called his 4 freedoms. That is freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And he articulated this as the ideals that were propelling the United States to fight against fascism. Big business added one more freedom, free enterprise. Advertisers helped on this front, trying to make the war about consumption. So, for example, there was an ad for Royal typewriters that said, "Hasten the day when you can once more walk into any store in the land and buy anything you want." During the war, the National Resources Planning Board put forth a vision for the peacetime economy based on 3 criteria: full employment for all Americans in the United States, an expanded welfare state evolving out of the New Deal, and a higher standard of living. In 1944, FDR even called for a new economic Bill of Rights to guarantee these freedoms through an expansion of federal powers. Now, this didn't happen, but the idea had influence. For one thing, Congress did pass the GI Bill of Rights in 1944, which worked amazingly well for some, providing veterans low-cost home mortgages, financial assistance for education, and so on, essentially creating, through government policies, the 1950s generation. Furthermore, the fact that the war was against the Nazis, with their extreme racist ideology, turned the United States thinking to the opposite direction. Thus, the United States emerged from World War II inclining in the direction of openness, tolerance, and racial equality. This is when intellectuals began publishing books debunking the supposed scientific basis of racism. But understand, this did not mean that the United States was suddenly not racist. Of course not, and not at all. The vision of the 4 freedoms was not limited to the United States, but extended across the planet. For example, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, wrote a book called The American Century and published an article actually before Pearl Harbor on the American vision for its place in the world. dig it. Very early on in his article, Henry Luce drops this line. He says, American jazz, Hollywood movies, American slang, American machines and patented products are in fact the only things that every community in the world, from Zanzibar to Hamburg, recognizes in common. In fact, Luce begins a list of American priorities beginning with the economic. He says, we know perfectly well that there is not the slightest chance of anything faintly resembling a free economic system prevailing in this country if it prevails nowhere else. And so the United States now, according to Henry Luce, has a mission, an almost sort of evangelical mission to bring consumer-style capitalism into the international arena. All of these booms, combined with the euphoria over the Allied victory, generated a culture of what James Patterson has called grand expectations in American society. As the historian put it, high expectations rooted in vibrant economic growth ascended as never before after World War II and peaked in the 1960s, during which faith in the wealth of the United States and in the capacity of the federal government to promote progress aroused unprecedented rights consciousness on the home front. America's political leaders, meanwhile, managed to stimulate enormous expectations about the nation's ability to direct world affairs. So, in these ways, and in brief, World War II changed everything. Understand, we're talking here about expectations, the anticipation of what was to come that would in itself create the future United States and the world. Much of what we take for granted was still on the horizon. Consider, for example, some of the things that were yet to come in 1945. Supermarkets, malls, fast food chains, residential air conditioning, ranch-style homes, freezers, dishwashers, and detergents. Also ballpoint pens, tape recorders, four-lane highways, automatic transmissions, power steering. None of these things yet existed in 1945, but there was great grand expectations that stuff like this was coming. In these and many other ways, the daily lives of most Americans had changed very little from the 1930s. So the changes that we're going to see historically are in motion and yet to come. A little more than a third of the population lived in cities of 50,000 or more. Although suburbs had long existed, the fantastic wave of suburban sprawl was still coming in the future. There were 25.8 million registered cars in 1945, nearly one for every 3 adults. But that was only 2.7 million more than in 1929, when there were 18 million fewer people. So culturally as well as demographically, the United States remained in many ways a world of farms, small towns, and modest-sized cities for now. Consider two major social transformations on the American scene, spurred by the war, but still largely on the horizon. So these are shades of things to come. Consider the case of women in the United States, American women. Contrasting interpretations of women appeared in the post-war period. So on the one hand, you had the strong image of Rosita Riveter during World War II propaganda to promote the idea of women taking up the jobs of industrial labor while men were at war. It's clear that there's no real easy generalizations to be made about the varying experiences of women in this period, but there are 4 broad points that can be made. First, World War II changed the lives of many women, bringing them into the marketplace in record numbers and providing them with higher paying jobs. Second, demobilization quickly drove many of these women out of these jobs and into a kind of space of domestic containment in the 1950s, where these sort of traditional or newly decided traditional roles of women were being promoted and articulated in the 1950s in a sort of like the promotion of normalcy and domestic containment. Third, many of these women didn't think that they were making an either or choice during the war when it comes to home versus work, and in fact, although they were driven out of the workplace of some of these jobs at that time, it was only temporary, and the stage was being set for the rise of the feminist movements of the 1950s and then especially the 1960s. Finally, all of this was taking place within an American culture still dominated by these traditional notions of femininity. Around 125,000 African Americans served overseas during World War II. Many, such as the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion, famously decorated for distinction. At the same time, back in the United States, in one of the most significant demographic shifts in American history, roughly 1 million black Americans followed the wartime boom to the north. Another 1.5 million would leave the South during the 1950s. Of course, it was impossible to ignore the hypocrisy of African Americans fighting against racist Nazi fascism in the name of the United States and Europe, while the armed forces, like American society at home, remained segregated. As in other areas of society, there were some grand expectations that changes made during the war would prove lasting in terms of civil rights and equality. During the war, for example, the NAACP and other black activists initiated what they called the WW campaign. That the WW stood for Victory Over Fascism Abroad, Victory Over Discrimination at Home. So black civil rights leaders, African American activists, were linking the fight against fascism in Europe to the fight against segregation and racism in the United States. So large numbers of African Americans migrated from poor southern farms to munition centers, and racial tensions were high in overcrowded cities like Boston or Chicago. Detroit and Harlem experienced race riots in 1943. Black newspapers created the WW campaign to build black morale and head off more radical action. Their efforts redefined citizenship, equating their patriotism with war work, and seeking equal employment opportunities, government entitlements, and better working conditions as fitting for appropriate full citizens of the United States. The point here is the way in which the war enhanced and the blend of American ideology, economic needs, and national identity, and combined to shape visions of domestic politics and global order. Around and inside the White House, there was great optimism about the future that emerged from the United States' unique position in the world after World War II. Roosevelt and Truman and their colleagues expected the United States to emerge from the war as the greatest power on earth. It was during the war itself that they began laying the groundwork for the post-war order. What world would they create at the war's end? What lessons could be learned from past failures, especially those that followed World War I? The memory of the Depression, both at home and abroad, weighed heavily in the thinking of FDR and U.S. policymakers. By 1945, the United States was in a uniquely preeminent position, and there was a consensus among policymakers that victory had confirmed the universal superiority of American values, including, quote, individual liberty, representative government, free enterprise, private property, and a marketplace economy. Given the country's overwhelming power, they now expected to refashion the world in America's image and create the American century. They intended to promote world peace and foster international stability at the same time that they safeguarded national security, perpetuated American power, and further augmented American prosperity. It was a wonderful image. So what could possibly go wrong? Or right, depending on the way you look at it.